was Christopher Columbus's native language? Although he worked for the Spanish crown and wrote a lot in Castilian Spanish and Latin, most scholars don't think that either of those were his native language. Him not speaking Latin is probably obvious, but for Spanish it has to do with patterns of grammatical errors that he would make and also just conflicting theories about where he was from. The default theory that's been contested more and more over the years is that he's from Genoa. And there's some pretty good evidence behind this because that's just like straight up where he said he was from. Like he legit said, I came from there and there I was born, which would imply that he spoke the Ligurian Romance language. And although Genoa is part of Italy today, Ligurian is actually pretty distinct from standard Italian and it's actually closer to French in some ways. Anyway, so that's one theory supported by just like personal first-person testimony, but there are some pretty valid reasons why people cast doubt on this. First of all, there's not a single record of him ever speaking or writing the Ligurian language. And also there's some evidence that some of the errors he would make in Spanish came from influence from Portuguese. For instance, writing falar instead of hablar for to speak. There's theories that he might have actually been from Galicia, where they speak a very similar language to Portuguese, but the errors that he was making seemed more like they were from Portuguese influence and not from Galician influence. But also these Portuguese errors don't necessarily mean that that was his native language. The standard biography of his life accounts for this because it says he moved to Portugal when he was in his 20s and then probably learned Portuguese and then later Spanish and maybe mixed them up a little bit. Another interesting theory says he was from Valencia because of some interesting grammatical errors he would make. For instance, he'd often use weird expressions in Spanish that seemed like word-for-word calques of Valencian or Catalan expressions. There was even a recent genetic study and documentary that seemed to support this. However, it was criticized by a lot of experts because it wasn't peer-reviewed and basically all it really established is that we can't rule out that he might have been a Sephardic Jew from Valencia. But it also didn't really rule out that he could have been Genoese, and he straight up just said he was. Another recent genetic study established that we can't rule out that he might have been Galician, but again, that goes against the linguistic evidence we talked about earlier. Personally, I still lean towards the theory that he grew up speaking Ligurian but just never learned how to write it, because he likely grew up working class and only learned to write more prestigious languages later in his life. But I'm definitely still open to other theories. Also, if you want to learn any of the languages discussed in this video, including under-resourced ones like Ligurian and Galician, check out my site linguardia.com.